What would men born before the first industrial revolution have made of scenes like this? Work that would once have been done by 1,000 men can now be done by a handful. But there is a trade-off. The machines that help them cost millions of dollars, and the fuel they burn a king's ransom. Smelting the ore disgorged from thousands of giant tinker toys like this is a cause of acid rain. It's the story of modern industry in miniature, a story that billions of new workers are about to rewrite. According to the evidence of fossils, bacteria were the first inhabitants of Earth. They are everywhere, deep in the ocean, high in the atmosphere, in frozen wastes and boiling springs. We never see bacteria, though there are more of them on each of us than there are people on the planet. A few cause disease, but most are good to us, using their digestive juices, enzymes, to break down the world's garbage like a natural waste recycler. This is the chemistry biotechnology is learning to exploit. Bacteria don't stop at eating organic matter. In a New Mexico mine, water is sprinkled through huge dumps of ore containing worthless iron pyrite and valuable copper. Bacteria attack the pyrite and produce oxidized iron and sulfuric acid. These dissolve the copper, producing a lagoon of copper sulfate blue at the base of the leach dump. Because of its taste for iron pyrite, better known as fool's gold, Theobacillus ferrooxidans is coining real profits for the copper miners. The next step is to remove unwanted metals from the solution. Finally, the purified solution flows into an enormous bath. Electricity is passed through the liquid, and the copper is deposited on plates.
It's really a very nice tool for a mining property like ours to have available to it. It takes a very long time to recover copper out of a leach dump. That's one of the disadvantages. The traditional mining and milling methods and smelting methods are very quick turnaround on the copper, very quick recoveries. Leaching isn't quite as quick. However, we can make copper for about half the cost that the conventional method does.
As well as saving money, mining microbes save the environment. No smelting means no acid rain. Biotechnology promises to produce a cleaner tomorrow, but it may have ways to mop past mistakes as well. The beauty and the power of Niagara Falls have captivated visitors for years. But the power it could generate has also lured industry to it. William Love started it off. The canal he began to dig in 1894, intending to found a metropolis on hydroelectricity, was abandoned after a mile. In 1978, this long-forgotten trench, which then had a school built over it, achieved a notoriety it will not live down. In the 40s, chemical waste had been buried in the canal in metal drums. In 1978, rotting drums rose up in a bizarre parody of a resurrection. The panic that followed revealed alarming levels of cancer, miscarriage, and birth defects in local residents who have since been evacuated. Now, Love Canal is a far cry from the pleasant suburb Luella Kenny moved to with her young family.
It was just idyllic, truly, with the oak trees in the backyards and the wandering down to the creek and just putting a fishing pole in there and just exploring for frogs and pollywogs and things that young boys would enjoy.
The Kenny family were not to know that the creek was polluted. Even after her youngest son, John, had a spell in hospital with a mystery disease, Luella did not suspect that chemical wastes from the Love Canal dump were poisoning his favorite playground.
He continued to play in the backyard and towards the creek. And then we found out later that the creek had 32 parts per billion of dioxin in the spot where he played. We even had an occasion where a bird went into the creek at that spot, drank the water, and dropped dead in front of the state officials. And the state officials were just trying to tell us stories like the bird died of parasitic worm infestation. This was John's room. Our tinker toy, it's still here.
All through the summer of '78, John Kenny became more and more sick. But in or out of hospital, he never lost his sense of humor.
Still as sick as he was, because you could see he could hardly walk, his feet were swollen, his whole eyes and everything. And he wanted to tease his grandmother that he didn't come home, and he was hiding. And I can remember him answering the phone and her asking him, "How are you, John?" And he said, "I'm fine." He says, "Nani," he called his grandmother Nani. He says, "I'm fine, Nani." He says, "Don't you worry about me, because your blood pressure will go up and then you're going to get sick." But anyway, as it turned out, then he just started having difficulty breathing, and we took him back to the hospital again after 2 days, and then he just died.
There will be other love canals. You may live near one of them. Hiding places for the industrial nightmares that are left over from yesterday's consumers' dreams. The all-electric homes of the 20s and 30s made great demands on the electricity supply industry. As well as more power, better distribution was needed. New equipment that wouldn't catch fire when surges occurred. The answer was a wonder of its day, a stabilizing fluid that kept its cool no matter what. And stayed, and stayed, and stayed.
That stability, which was carefully worked into the material, was also what made it so difficult to dispose of once it was no longer used or needed in the equipment. The PCBs, as they've come to be known in the last few years, have the kind of a structure that is very difficult for most organisms to attack.
Just how hazardous PCBs are is still a subject for debate. But no one's taking any chances. These dumps contain a witch's brew of suspect compounds. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. Most things decompose. But 20th century technology has granted PCBs the gift of eternal life. Or almost. You can destroy them with great heat, but many countries don't have the facilities. Which is why the biotech approach is causing such excitement. PCBs have been around for 60 years. Was that long enough for nature to respond? Were there any bacteria that could dent the chemical's armor? That is what scientists from General Electric set out to find on a contaminated site in New York.
And indeed, almost every place we looked, we did find bacteria that could grow. This flask contains bacteria that have grown on the parent compound of PCBs. We then took that culture and added some PCBs to it to assess the competence of each of these different cultures for their ability to degrade PCBs. At the same time, we also purified the bacteria from this mixed culture into their individual components to ask the question which ones had the PCB degradative competence and which were the best. When we did that, we found over 24 pure strains, each of which had a different ability to degrade PCBs, several of which were outstanding, and is those that we are now continuing our studies with.
In the lab, they have singled out a number of genes which produce the enzymes that actually do the work of breaking down PCBs. When bacteria containing one or more of these genes were sprayed on a test site, a quarter of the PCBs were destroyed. But it took 4 months. Genetic engineering could improve this 1,000 times, the scientists believe. Although whether these gene-spliced bugs will ever be allowed outside the lab is another matter. When tankers started to go down, a young scientist thought there must be a better way to clean up after them. The storms that wrecked the tankers also wrecked the contraptions designed to prevent pollution. It was back to buckets and spades until the invention of the oil-eating bug.
And then get rid of the chloroform ether again.
Ananda Chakrabarty was the man who made the bug. But it took 5 years to establish his right to patent what was, in fact, the first living invention. Chakrabarty has been challenged every step of the way by people who think that what he does is dangerous and wrong. He does not use conventional gene splicing to create his cleanup bugs, but all the same, you won't find them in nature. Besides their main chromosome, many bacteria have extra ring-shaped molecules of DNA called plasmids. Each plasmid is composed of several genes. When bacteria mate, one can donate a copy of a plasmid to the other. This is what Chakrabarty exploits. To create a strain of bugs that can break down a complex chemical, he starts with one containing a suitable gene to begin the process. Other bugs are introduced with genes that will continue the job. Their surroundings and food supply are manipulated until the shuffling of plasmids produces a new strain. A strain in which all the useful genes are combined. The enzyme produced by oil-eating bugs is used to clean out pipes and tanks in the oil business. But the bugs themselves have never gone into action against pollution. In the lab, there are bugs that break down some of the nastiest chemicals known to man, but scientists are reluctant to let them out.
We don't want to do it because there are no clear-cut guidelines, and therefore I'm subject to lawsuits. These are usually nuisance lawsuits that people might bring, claiming that the microorganism I released might have somehow caused health problems for them and all that. So in general, we like to field test any new microorganism or product under supervision of the Environmental Protection Agency.
The career of another banned bug began here on the ski slopes. When nature lets us down, snowfalls can be manufactured thanks to bacteria called Pseudomonas syringae, also known as Ice Plus. Everybody knows that water freezes at 0, but not always. When all the Ice Plus are removed, it remains liquid at -6. Add some Ice Plus, and there's a snap freeze. Just 1 or 2 degrees of frost is enough to cost fruit growers millions of dollars a year. That's why a California company decided to wage war on these ice-making bacteria. They did it by creating another bug, in every way identical to Ice Plus, except they'd taken out the freezing gene. They called it Ice Minus. Strawberries sprayed with it survived exposure to frost, or at least the fridges in the lab. Legal battles raged to decide whether it was safe to test Ice Minus in the field. In the end, the inventors won the day. But the protesters saw its significance. The first permitted release of gene-spliced organisms.
Genetically engineered organisms are very analogous to the introduction of exotic, non-native organisms into our ecosystems from all over the world. Most of them have fit in, some of them have died out, but a few of them have become tremendous pests, causing billions of dollars a year in damage. Kudzu vine in the south, Dutch elm disease in the north, chestnut blight, starlings, gypsy moth. These are organisms from other parts of the world that found a habitat, proliferated, and became pests. We can't get rid of them. Now imagine the scale here with genetic engineered organisms. Imagine introducing scores, then hundreds, and then into the next century, thousands of genetically engineered viruses and bacteria, plant strains and animal breeds in massive commercial volume all over the world. Sheer statistics suggest that if only a small fraction of these organisms turn out to be pests, the damage could exceed in magnitude the damage we face with chemical pollutants, because these organisms, they're alive, they reproduce, and you can't get rid of them once they're in the environment.
In the case of gypsy moth, you're talking about something that is a natural component in and of itself, the ecosystem. Apparently, the predators and parasites that are necessary to keep populations of gypsy moth down are not present in sufficient numbers. In the case of Ice Minus, all of the normal competitors, predators, parasites are in place because its enemies are the same as the enemies of the original strains. So it's not at all the same as introducing some kind of foreign organism into an ecosystem that's not prepared to deal with it.
At public hearings, the inventors explained that their ice-minus bugs work by simply occupying a few spaces that ice plus would have taken. Others claim they are sowing the seeds of disaster.
You see, this particular bacteria is found all over the temperate regions of the world. Pseudomonas syringae, according to the researchers, and it's speculative, they think it blows into the upper atmosphere, triggering rain. It's an ice-nucleating bacteria. AGS eliminated the genetic instructions that make the ice. That could have long-term effects on lack of rainfall or stopping rainfall patterns. Is it worth a few temperature degrees of benefit to frost retardation if we have a long-term impact on rainfall patterns? Again, it's only a small probability risk. But if this risk materializes, the problem could be irreversible.
The amount of risk assessment studies that AGS was required to do before they were issued a permit to do this test is unprecedented in the history of the development of microbial pesticides, or in the history of the use of microbes in the environment. And this was because there was a lot of concern, not only public concern, but also concern within the regulatory agencies, but also because those of us at AGS who are involved in this thing are environmentally concerned, and there were a number of tests that we would have done regardless of whether or not they were required, because we want to make sure that that the field test would be safe.
We are in a rather Kafkaesque situation here. There is no risk assessment science to judge the risk of any of these introductions. There is no database on how genes transfer in nature, how organisms compete, how they survive. So we're in a situation of the government saying it's regulating a technology, knowing there's no predictive ecology or risk assessment science by which to regulate it.
The arguments basically have been that somehow, if a microorganism is genetically manipulated, it becomes somehow dangerous. Now that's a very weak and untenable argument, because researchers in the universities have been doing genetic manipulation for years. And as a routine procedure, we always isolate new type of microorganisms from nature. We change them genetically, and then we actually release them in the environment by dumping the whole thing in the laboratory sink. So, and there has absolutely been no incidence of any kind of hazard to the environment.
The debate continues. Californian strawberries are as prone to frosting as ever. The PCBs and dioxin in Luella Kenny's backyard may prevent her grandchildren playing there. Ananda Chakrabarti says it's a storm in a teacup. He is simply revving up evolution.
If we didn't do it now, nature would have done it over a period of 50 years. And what we are saying is that can we afford to wait for another 50 years for microorganisms to develop that would clean up the dioxins and the PCBs and the Agent Orange?